As promised, I'm back with a transistor radio, though it's not quite a 1950s transistor radio. This particular set was built by Warwick for the Sears company in around 1960, and Sears sold their transistor radios under the Silvertone brand. You'll notice that it says all transistor 500. It doesn't say, 6 transistors or 7 transistors. This is a 5 transistor set, which you could argue that the 500 alludes to. Now the model number of this set is actually 1214, which indicates the teal color. This radio was produced at a time when American transistor radio manufacturers were really losing out to the Japanese radio manufacturers. This set is kind of an awkward size, honestly. It's too big to be considered a coat pocket set, but it doesn't have any kind of carrying handle built in to easily tote it around, so you kind of have to hold it like this, and it's just not the most comfortable thing to carry. I will say I like the styling of this thing. It's pretty minimalist, but it's got a little bit of that 50s charm. It's got this little design here on the side. The dial kind of breaks things up nicely, and it's an attractive seafoam color, at least in the places that haven't been sun faded or otherwise discolored. However, this radio is a good example of the sort of cost-cutting driven circuit design that was pretty commonly found in American transistor radios from this time period. And those efforts to squeeze the nickels out, as people used to say, really kind of harmed the performance of these sets. They're just honestly inferior to the sets that were made a couple years before. Now I've changed all the electrolytic capacitors in here. I haven't really done an alignment or anything like that to try and perk it up more, but I don't know that there's really all that much you could improve this thing, particularly the sound quality. Alright, let's give it a listen.
During our Take a Chance Great Futures raffle on December 3rd.
Our live raffle will feature
You'll notice that tuning's a little bit tricky on this thing.
System, Yankee ticket.
And the volume kind of perks up momentarily after you hit dead on to the station.
For details, fees and taxes apply.
You know what I love about being a delivery driver? The money, baby. So every 3 months for 18 months.
Now watch what happens as I adjust the volume. It kind of hits a dip at the middle, and then comes back up. You notice that? That's a function of the strange circuit design in this thing. They squeezed 1 transistor out of the classic 6 transistor design, and the end result was inferior sound quality, weird tuning, just overall lesser performance really. Alright, let's take a look inside. The back cover is held on by this nice brass screw here. For reasons I cannot understand, they decided to mount the jack for the earphone on the back of the cabinet, which requires these longer wires and all that. I don't know why they didn't just put it over here. That way you can lay the radio flat on its back when you've got the earphone plugged in. It's extra labor and wire and all that, and it just makes it a little bit more annoying to use. So as you can see, it runs on 3 C cells, and it should run on them for a good while. It does at least have push-pull audio output. So here's the transistors it uses. We've got a converter, a first IF, a second IF, and then 2 audio output transistors, which you can see right there. By this point, the more modern style, modern is relative, but the more modern style cases had appeared, and you can see an example of that there. I forget exactly what the name is for that type of case. This lifts out, and you can see the other side of the chassis. So there's the capacitors I put in, and it's got one of these couplet things, which is basically a potted module with capacitors and resistors in it. That's just to save on assembly costs. And over here you can see the unshielded oscillator transformer And there's the antenna. It has an all-metal, air-variable tuning capacitor, as was still fairly commonly found on American sets, but had largely disappeared on Japanese ones. Personally, I prefer that style of tuning condenser. It's just very reliable. And that's really about all there is to show in there. Now, since I was planning to make a big point of the circuit design on this thing, I went and dug up the schematic for this set and another set from the same time period that uses a more typical design. Here's the two schematics. Both of these are from the Bateman's 1962 Most Often Needed Radio Servicing Information. On this page there's two Arvin schematics. I chose this schematic here because it uses a very classically designed audio output setup. So here's your audio driver transistor, and there's your two audio output transistors. And the important part here is the way the volume control is hooked up. So you can see there's a diode coming off the second IF transformer's output there, and then it goes through the variable resistor to ground, and then connected to the center tap of the variable resistor is this capacitor here, which couples the audio through that resistor to the audio driver transistor. This is a very, very typical setup, and you can see this in transistor radios from the early days until, I don't know, at least the 1970s on some Japanese models. And the same sort of thing is going on here in this one. This one has an additional audio amp transistor, but basically the same setup here with the variable resistor and the detector diode and that capacitor and all that. Then we have the Silvertone, models 1, 2, and 2, 1, 3, and 1, 4, and those are just the color variations. Black, coral, and blue. This is the so-called blue version, although I think teal or seafoam would be a more accurate name for it. And like in that Arvin set, the output of the final IF transformer feeds this germanium detector diode, which is then connected to one end of the volume control, and the other end is connected to ground, just like on that Arvin schematic. But where the center tap goes is unusual. So you see it comes down here to this capacitor. Sure, that's pretty typical. But then it goes into this network of resistors and capacitors, and that's where things really diverge. So whereas here there was this audio driver transistor, here it's feeding back through these resistors and capacitors to the second IF transformer there. So it's a what Philco called a reflex design. There's also another feedback path here through this resistor to this capacitor, and then to the first IF. That's the automatic gain control. That's actually fairly typical. You can actually see it here on the Arvin schematic too. So from the diode through a resistor, there's that capacitor there that kind of averages out the signal, and then into that first IF transformer. So yeah, the odd part is where the center tap of the volume control goes, and the end result of this is a set that works. It picks up stations and can adjust the volume and all that, but the sound quality just isn't as good. This seems to add significant distortion to the audio, and you have to have it tuned really precisely onto the station, and that's less true of more typical designs. So yeah, they squeezed the transistor out of this thing, but I don't really know how much money they saved, and the end result was a radio that just doesn't work as well, so I'm not sure that was worth it. Also, notice this little dashed outline here. That's the couplate component I pointed out earlier, the potted module. So all these little capacitors and resistors are all inside there. So if one of these burns out, you've got to replace that whole couplate, or maybe bypass part of it. These are fairly reliable components, though. It's not something one would normally need to change. Well, I hope you guys found this video interesting. And if any of you have a story to share about one of these weird, kind of low-end American transistor radios, I'd like to hear it. I wonder if your experiences are similar to mine. Thanks for watching.